Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. We're so glad you've joined us today. I'm Elif Sarican, writer, editor, translator, and your host. At the Amargi Mosaic, we're piecing together conversations from Kurdistan and the Middle East, bringing you stories and insights you might not hear elsewhere. We're a grassroots funded media collective powered by journalists and academics who believe in independent voices, not corporate agendas. So whether you're here to learn, stay informed, or simply curious about the region, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow us at theamargi.com and on all the social media platforms you see on your screen. Your support helps us grow and keep these conversations alive. And now let's get started. I have Professor David Wengrow with me here today, my good friend. Hi, David.
Hi, Elif.
So you're Professor of Comparative Archaeology at University College London. You're the author of What Makes Civilization, the Ancient Near East and the Future of the West, published, I believe, in 2010, and also
Mhm.
co-author with David Graeber of The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which has fundamentally challenged how we think about human social development and political organization, and also acted for a lot of people almost as an antidote to the kind of sleepy and prevalent accounts out there of the history of humanity and civilization. Your archaeological work has taken you to Mesopotamia, which includes Kurdistan since the late 1990s, first in the Kurdish regions of Turkey, also known as North Kurdistan, and then in Iraqi Kurdistan from the early 2010s, I believe. Um, so you first worked in North Kurdistan, southeast Turkey around 1998, then began fieldwork in Iraqi Kurdistan around 2011, as I said. So this means you've been around or engaged in Kurdistan throughout the quite dramatic transformations in these regions, from unfortunately the many wars and massacres that have been seen in the region to democratic experiments like those in northeast Syria and Rojava. You also mentioned that whilst you and David Graeber were spending a lot of time together and discussing the ideas that became the book, The Dawn of Everything, he hadn't yet connected with Öcalan's ideas in the same way. But later, when he wrote a foreword to one of Öcalan's books, you actually happened
Mm.
to be in Kurdistan. But before we get to that, what I want to ask is, obviously archaeological work happens in literally every corner of the world. What drew you to Mesopotamia and parts of Kurdistan as a place of archaeological interest to begin with? And how
Mhm.
do you think your archaeological work in these, I guess, what some would call contested lands, shape your thinking about alternatives to the state?
I think I'd already decided in 1998 what my PhD topic was going to be. I think I was finishing my master's degree at the University of Oxford at the time, and I'd already decided that I wanted to focus on this very long period of time, which actually comes between the first appearance of agriculture in the so-called Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. Between that and the emergence of cities, there's a very long period of almost, let's see, about 5,000 years, in which all kinds of fascinating things happen. You get the refinement of farming practices, metallurgy, textile production, forms of hospitality and domestic life, even actually systems of administration and mathematical notation that eventually lead to the invention of writing. But none of these inventions have yet been harnessed to a permanent apparatus of coercion. We don't have kingdoms yet. We don't have empires yet in the region, or indeed anywhere in the world at that point. And around that time, I got an opportunity to supervise the excavation. I'd already done quite a bit of archaeological fieldwork by then. So to supervise part of an excavation, an area of a site called Domuztepe, which is just south of Maraş, actually. And I don't think I'd ever been to Turkey before, and we had a very long journey there, which actually passed through the famous Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, which was not yet in 1998 a kind of tourist heritage center the way it is today. You still had to get there on the back of a tractor across farmers' fields. But we met the archaeologists working there from all over the world, and we picked up various bits of equipment. And then we headed east and we set up our excavation camp in a Kurdish village called Gelebişler, south of Maraş. And what happens in these situations is fairly typical. The government, in this case, the Turkish government, sends you a government representative who stays with you all the time. And it's always, I mean, even without the particular history of that region, it's always a difficult relationship because that person is also an outsider. They're usually from the city, a city. And Kelebishla is tiny, one of the many, many tiny villages there where most of the young men were abroad, mostly, I was told, in Germany, working for wages. And so it's largely women and children and very large sheepdogs. And one thing I do remember is a very prominent bust statue of Ataturk right in the middle of the village, which was the only thing that was in any way sort of monumental in this tiny place. And I worked there and I did a full season's excavation, and then didn't really think too much about that particular region again for a while. And then around the time you mentioned, 2010, 11, Iraqi Kurdistan was really opening up to foreign collaborations. And this is, of course, after decades of neglect and restrictions under the Ba'ath Party on any sort of cultural activity. So there were whole missing generations there of training and resources. So they were very open to teams coming in and bringing those things in collaboration. And a colleague of mine was really keen that we should go out and take a look at these sites, which are actually very close to the town of Halabja on the Iranian border. And purely by chance, it must have been the 25th anniversary, I think, of the genocide or so-called Anfal campaign. And I was obviously a bit concerned because you're taking students with you and that sort of thing, about the state of the land and the water and everything in that region after the chemical attacks of 1988. And purely by chance, I turned the TV on and there was the famous British journalist John Simpson, who I believe was one of the first people the Iranians let in over the border after the end of that war into Halabja, and recorded, documented some of the horrors there. And he was back there. He was doing like a retrospective, and he was with this guy, British guy called Hamish de Breton Gordon, probably an OBE, CB, 5th Tank Regiment. I can't quite remember all his titles. And this guy works at Porton Down. He's one of the leading experts on chemical weapons in the UK. I think he worked on the Litvinenko trial. And they were in Halabja with these instruments testing for sarin, tabun traces. And indeed, the area has not been, I believe, to this day, fully decontaminated. So I thought, well, that's my guy. And I got to him through someone in the chemistry department at my university at UCL. And we met and they did a full risk assessment for us. They gave us some basic training and things not to tread on or what to do in a situation. And that was sufficient to make it possible for us to go out there. But it was a complex situation. Halabja itself has a museum. It's not an archaeological museum as such. It's a museum of the genocide. But actually, just a few years earlier, I think in 2006, the local residents in Halabja had actually attacked the museum and tried to burn it down because of tensions around the use of the memory. of the genocide to raise funds, is my understanding. And very few of those funds, it seems, were going back into Halabja. They weren't seeing new schools, hospitals, new roads, and all the rest of it. So there were great tensions around that as well. So I knew I was going into a very complex situation. And that's right, around the same time, a colleague of mine here, a guy called Gabriel Mashenska, gave me a copy of Öcalan's prison diaries, which was out in English in hardback at the time. And he thought I'd be interested. And he was right. I was very interested because I've always been fascinated by how archaeology, actually, its history comes largely out of constitutional law. It doesn't come out of people wandering randomly around fields, picking up bunches, bits of junk and so on, and then becoming more professional at it. It really comes out of these debates that happen mostly in Northern Europe about what societies were like before empire. It's actually the roots of many of our parliamentary systems and things come from these ideas about the primitive Germans, the early Batavians, what were the early Britons and the Gauls like, what kind of societies did they have? And in Europe, that produced nationalism. And what really struck me about Öcalan's writings when I read them for the first time is that here you have a case of a person in a way doing the same thing, but also a kind of personal odyssey that seems to have taken him from similar views to something very different, to do with women's rights, but still this deep view of human politics where the past takes on this kind of mythical dimension and how to harness that power for freedom rather than domination, but not the freedoms of nationalism, not the freedoms of the nation state, but social freedoms of a kind that I think are very difficult for most of us to even imagine these days.
And yeah, and I think that that kind of combination particularly makes that region of the world a really fascinating place, not just because it's obviously really interesting history, but perhaps what it could mean for the future of, how we organize as humans, and also literally the continuity of the world. In an October 2024 speech titled "Where Mother Goddesses Go to Die," you explored how we've misread, and this is what is also what is present a lot in The Dawn of Everything, how we've misread ancient societies, um, and your work consistently challenges the inevitability of states and hierarchies. And this is like the sleepy accounts that I referred to when introducing you, which is, often accounts of history to justify how we got to where we got to today. I want to read just an excerpt of that speech. The speech is, sadly, for those listening, is not published anywhere yet, but hopefully will be somewhere soon. But I'll read an excerpt of it to give people a taste of, what you were exploring in that speech, which I think was really important, actually.
Sure.
So you say, thanks to a colleague at my institute, I was already familiar with Öcalan's prison diaries before I went to Kurdistan, and even before I met David Graeber. I remember that what had impressed me immediately was the deep view of human politics you can find there. Here was Here was a man at that time still held under a death sentence, submitting a defense to the European Court of Human Rights that was based partly on an appeal to what he calls Neolithic social values, values that he says can only be found by extending our vision of human politics beyond the last 4,000 years, beyond the footprint of patriarchy and down into periods of human history before the appearance of city-states, kingdoms, and empires. Effectively, you say, Öcalan seemed to be saying something like this: to put me on trial, you have to understand the roots of the broader Kurdish situation. And to understand that situation, one has to first understand its origins in history and in systems of law. These origins, he goes on to explain, lie not just in the recent past, but also in systems of oppression which first appeared in the Middle East more than 4,000 years ago and have reappeared in one guise or another ever since. From the age of masked gods and disguised kings to the present. In other words, Öcalan seems to be saying, if you cannot properly understand the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, you cannot pursue a legal claim against me, which
mm,
obviously is a, big claim in and of itself. And I want
mm,
to, you also said in that speech, which I thought was a very important observation, is whilst it's respectable, particularly in progressive circles, to discuss, techno-feudalism or
mm,
managerial feudalism,
mm,
the return of systems of domination in new guises, the
mm,
idea that forms of human freedom could similarly reappear is met with scorn or ridicule, whether it's in
mm,
universities, so, kind of in scholarly explorations, or in certain progressive
mm.
discussions and the movements that are built around those. And, this seems particularly poignant given that, and as you say, any serious scholar readily accepts the Neolithic's material innovations,
Mm-hmm,
agriculture, metallurgy,
mm-hmm,
textiles, but not the spiritual values and social forms that came with them. And I find this very interesting. And obviously, particularly in the dawn of everything, this comes up not just in relation to Mesopotamia, but in the research that you and David Graeber did in terms of the west coast of what is now the United States of
mm-hmm.
America and also what is now parts of Canada as well. What do you think? I mean, I want to hear your reflections on that speech, but also, what do you think, academia or, the political imagination that comes of it has this fundamental asymmetry? Why can we accept the cyclical return of hierarchy, but not of freedom?
Well, the standard, rather scornful response that you get is usually along the lines that you're romanticizing or repeating tropes of the noble savage, which are often attributed to Rousseau, although actually Rousseau never said that. Um, and actually, if you look at the history of that strategy, it's a strategy for basically making fun of people who try to identify or attribute progressive social achievements to non-Europeans, people in the ancient past, or anyone who doesn't fit neatly into what you might call the Western canon of ideas, from Aristotle to Tocqueville or something. Um, and actually, if you look at where that strategy comes from, it's very interesting. It really comes through racism. I mean, it comes through the eugenics movement in the 19th century, Victorian era. Um, Not so much from the Enlightenment in the 18th, 17th, 18th century as people think. But it really comes hand in hand through the writings of people like John Crawford as a strategy to kind of negate any attempt to do that. And it's been an incredibly successful strategy, which is still used today. The minute you attempt to say anything um, positive or progressive about Aboriginal Australia, Indigenous Amazonia, the Neolithic of the Middle East, you'll immediately be labeled an idealist, a utopian, a dreamer. But as you say, if you want to point out that certain features of feudalism, a medieval phenomenon, have reappeared in a digital world, that is somehow regarded as rather clever and worthy of debate and serious discussion. I don't know why that's the case. I I think it's obviously pretty disastrous in terms of social movements and how they relate to human history. Um, but I don't have any real explanation for it, but it's certainly real. I mean, I've encountered it more times than I care to remember.
And I mean, the in a in a conversation that you and David Graeber had a few years before he passed, you both talk about this kind of projection on, in a way, why kind of indigenous societies or pre-capitalist societies, in particularly in the Enlightenment era, when they were engaging with these societies, but also after,
Mm,
try and explain away why these societies were happier. And there's this projection, it seems, where its happiness is almost this like simple minded in being
mm,
hyper present. So it's because these societies lack complexity in their ability to understand the past or the future, and they are just hyper present, and therefore do not have a political consciousness, or are not political in when I say political, I mean like as a polity.
mhm.
Then they don't have a collective political consciousness, and therefore they're able to kind of float through the days and be happy because they don't really know if they're coming or going.
Yeah, it's another strategy of negation. And actually, what it says is even if they did have political consciousness, it would be kind of locked up in a particular mode of subsistence or mode of production. And this is a really difficult interface with, let's say, orthodox Marxist thought, which is where a lot of these ideas about modes of production come from, originally as a theory of liberation. Um, but these days, the bit at the end about the proletariat becoming self-conscious and freeing itself from its chains tends to be left out, and you're just left with this story about kind of fall from primordial hunter-gatherer innocence into inequality and no way back. So it actually raises all kinds of difficult questions for historical materialism, for example.
Yeah, and more on that a little bit later. I do want to speak a little bit about that. But what I wanted to first ask you was, in the dawn of everything, as we've already alluded to and, spoken a little bit about, you and David reject, as you know, the main, well, as of course you know, but as other people who may have read the book know, primarily started with the thesis of the rejection of search for a singular origin of
Mm,
inequality, which seems to have become a almost a the main or the core civilizational question. But obviously, as we know, many political movements confront this for various reasons. Though there's movements like the Kurdish movement that go back to history to confront the loss of freedom as at its root and not necessarily inequality. Do you think do you think this opens up, the kind of inverting the search for a singular origin of inequality into a search for freedoms or the lacks thereof, or both, and how they relate to each other? Do you think this opens up something quite radical that humans have always experimented with different arrangements, like, the seasonality
yeah.
that you guys talk about?
I think it does. I mean, rejecting a single point of origin for inequality means rejecting the narrative of a primordial fall from grace. Once upon a time, we were relatively free, relatively equal, and then one thing happened to change all that forever. And you get different versions of this. Maybe it's agriculture, maybe it's the plow, maybe it's the rise of the state. One thing we insisted on, and none of those stories really hold up to scrutiny, which was one of the things we were doing in that book, was showing that. But one thing that David Graeber and I really insisted on from the beginning of that project is that abandoning those kind of stories, abandoning the story of a fall from innocence, does not mean abandoning hopes and dreams of human emancipation. Actually, we felt that once you take off those kind of mind forged manacles, take off the blinkers and look at the human past and the evidence of the human past with fresh eyes, it actually becomes far more interesting, almost an encyclopedia of different social possibilities. Suddenly you have egalitarian cities. matriarchal confederations, but also hunter-gatherers who practiced slavery or set up seasonal police squads.
And yeah, I mean, that's all really, really interesting, particularly when, when we see some of the evidence being uncovered around where possible how some of those the specifics of that could look like it. And it sometimes feels like especially when reading The Dawn of Everything, that one is reading a very elaborate novel and that it's like at every turn that something very dramatic might happen, and perhaps this is how you both intended it. I also wanted to ask you, how do you respond to those? And I imagine particularly it's, some of the historical materialists, but it might come from other directions as well, who may say that these arguments, and I know you just you kind of referenced it a little bit, but if you could explore it a bit more, who might say that these arguments may ignore the immediate inequality or material needs of people, whether we're seeing particularly in many parts of the West, in Britain as well, the cost of living crisis and so on, and that a level of, trying to achieve equality might actually really radically change people's lives before one gets to, the kind of freedoms that you're also exploring in The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, well, I think you may disagree with me, but I think you're playing devil's advocate. But I think what you're saying or the views you're expressing roughly correspond to what our friend Graeber would have called the extreme center, which basically says we can try to adjust the system, we can tweak the system, but we can't change the system. And the inequalities, the material inequalities you're talking about, if you're a materialist, presumably you must accept on principle that those don't come out of thin air. They come out of
Yeah.
the system. And that system has a material aspect and an ideological and conceptual aspect, like all systems that exist in human societies. It's institutionalized. And what we're interested in primarily in the book is what we call the third of our three basic forms of human freedom, which is the freedom to change the system. So fine, if you want to talk about tax regimes and that sort of thing, or housing, of course, who would be against that? But why are we forbidden, or why do we forbid ourselves to talk about anything that could actually be described as in any tiny way more radical than that, in terms of actually examining the underlying logic of the system that is producing those inequalities and, by all measures, extending and increasing them every single year.
Yeah, and I guess that what David would refer to that as exercise also would be, basically treating imagination as serious political work, right? And,
Yeah.
you know,
And also thinking about scale, I read a study a few years back about gender inequalities within the 1%. It's actually really fascinating. They looked at the domestic structures of the richest billionaires on the planet, and they're incredibly patriarchal. Isn't that fascinating? And, I think it does tie into some of these ideas that you find in Bookchin and Öcalan, that actually the roots of this ultimately are not found in these kind of macro historical processes. They're found in those very intimate relationships, family structures, domestic relations. There's something there that I think is very significant.
yeah, I mean, I guess what that's saying is, more material ability obviously doesn't, I mean, perhaps for a lot of people, this would be stating the obvious or quite a basic thing. More material ability doesn't obviously bring other freedoms. And actually, I was discussing this with a few friends the other day and talking about, the family and the family structure,
Mm,
the nuclear family is not possible in the same way. Not that it's anything to aspire to go back to in the kind of like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s kind of like, American dream-esque way. Obviously, that's not something to aspire to, but it's also materially and economically not possible in unless you're the top 1%, as you've also just spoken about. It's not possible to have only one member of a household work. You just can't get by. You wouldn't be able to have a even a half decent life. And perhaps in a way, I mean, this is probably a bit, economic reductionism, but in a way, that inequality is possible in the 1% because obviously the more wealth there is, the more you can afford to only have one person in work and therefore the other one economically dependent. And that doesn't mean that again, it's to fetishize like women being able to work, but the economic system, as women have, gained these quite hard earned gains, it has also become that the society is dependent on that kind of economic labor of
Yeah,
women entering the labor force.
I think that's right. And I don't think we understand very well the connections between these things. Also, in the broader scope of history, why is it actually that societies that do have, let's say, a high degree of women's autonomy, have actually not tended to form empires. Actually, it's something I'm very interested in at the moment, all around the northern rim of the Indian Ocean. There's a whole range of societies that exist on the edge of empires,
Mm,
big, powerful terrestrial empires like the Persians and the Romans and Kushans and the Han Chinese, which resist that kind of domination. And with incredible frequency, the people who lead or are most visible to us historically in this resistance are women in Vietnam, in
mm,
Sudan, in Indonesia. And I'm talking about things happening over 1,000 years ago now. Um, why is that the case? What's going on there? And what does it tell us about the intrinsic connection between patriarchy and empire?
mm.
I think are things we don't understand terribly well because to even start talking about them, you've got to be willing to talk about non-patriarchal systems. And coming back to our earlier discussion about noble savages, the minute you start doing that, you get this almost hysterical kind of counter-reaction, saying you're going off the deep end or something.
Yeah, and I think, whether it's, the extreme center that David Graeber would talk about, or, some of the kind of seasoned anti-imperialists talking about patriarchy as the root of, well, I guess
Mhm.
to put it quite simply, the issues we face today is has been for a very long time just treated as either unserious or as a distraction. And
Mhm.
this is part of the motivation of, of some of the developments or some of the ways it seems that the Kurdish movement was formed, which is actually the things that are often treated as either distractions and or kind of what can be left to an afterthought we need to bring to the core.
I didn't know that. That's really fascinating. I mean, a lot of work in my field, archaeology and anthropology, historically has been concerned with what another colleague of mine, Norman Yoffe, called myths of the archaic state, really creating and reinforcing myths of the state as a kind of transcendent force in human history. And the basic idea was that there are these regularities to human social development which tend towards the formation of bureaucratically ordered states. And anyone who deviates from that, what you're talking about there, the afterthought, the footnote, anyone who tries to swim, even for a short while, against those currents is basically going up a blind alley or down a rabbit hole. It has no real historical consequence. It's just a little deviation or something. So the idea was always to find out what leads societies from, let's say, elementary to complex forms, when in fact it had already been decided that complexity means hierarchy and that hierarchy means chains of command. So it means as soon as large numbers of people decide to live together or join into a common project, they also supposedly need to start forcing people to obey rules by beating them over the head or locking them up or electrocuting them or whatever. And places like Hawaii or Madagascar, where Graeber did his field work, were supposed to be like the laboratories where social scientists could see the stages playing out. Now, nobody believes this stuff today. I mean, the theory just didn't work. But nothing was ever put in its place. There were just these endless critiques. It was like 4 decades of critique or something. So we try in the book we wrote together to put two things in place of that. One is this concept of three basic forms of human freedom: to move away, to disobey, to change the social order. And the other one is a theory about three basic forms of domination, which David was already playing around with, I think probably before I ever met him, but never really tried to exemplify it. So what we do in the book is sort of put it to the test with these societies that have been called early states or archaic states: ancient Egypt, the Inca Empire, early Mesopotamian city-states. And actually what we find is that what we call the state today is really a very recent coming together of three distinct principles of power or domination that actually have entirely separate histories of development. And those are power that comes from control over physical force or violence, power that comes from control over knowledge or information, and thirdly, power generated through individual charisma, personality.
Mm. And you both speak about and you spoke about this, even before the book was out, when you would be when you did some events together in conversation about, for certain indigenous, or I guess what could be called like prehistoric societies, the
Mm,
idea that having some extra corn could give you power over others was, just seen or understood as quite absurd. And I think what you've just said, and in terms of how Graeber was trying to develop these, particularly these like forms of domination, which I think he also called like forms of hierarchy, and in
hmm
as through some of the work he tried to do in like his like value theory
hmm
work. I think all of that also kind of culminated in, it seems, that you both started the book in search for the origins of the question of inequality, social inequality. And it seems like through the explorations, it kind of almost became the book, I think, perhaps came a book about the origins of how we got stuck and stuckness.
hmm hmm
And it seems that, the thesis, and what I know you're developing a bit more now, became about how do we therefore become unstuck. And
Yeah.
you know yeah, so what do you think, what caused hierarchy to become stuck, and therefore to stop being something we could, as human society, slip in and out of? When did we become, essentially, I guess, also had how Graeber would describe it, when did we become so boring and just got stuck in one way of living?
Yeah. I mean, it's a provocation, obviously. That book actually was intended to be a kind of question book, a questioning book, and also to some extent a speculative book about just trying to figure out some more fun and interesting questions one could ask about the human past than what is the origins of inequality, which we've been going around in circles with for 350 years or something, and which we ultimately decided was a pretty silly question to begin with, albeit one with a really fascinating history of its own that we try to tell. The question about being stuck is the one we ended up with, was, if you don't do that, if you just do away with these kind of biblically inspired ideas that once we were perfect and then we fell from grace, what else could you talk about? What else could you ask? And what really struck us, having worked our way through this incredible kind of cornucopia of human possibilities, is how tedious contemporary society is in its kind of fatalistic addiction to actually very dangerous kind of personally quite harmful practices that people are very aware. I mean, it's like being stuck on a train and you know that you're going to head off a cliff, but you can't get off the tracks. Um, why do we find ourselves as a species in that situation? And what would happen if we actually address that question head on? And partly the work I'm now embarking on is to try and take that aspect of the project forwards. And that really is a question more about the three basic forms of human freedom, because the third freedom is exactly that capacity to reshuffle the deck of your social reality in a way that's not just trivial. Actually try something else.
And you've said that it seems that that exploration is also taking you to some of the parts of the world, particularly where society had women's autonomy at its core. So, like, what role did women play in these, I guess, what we could call stateless or somewhat autonomous societies? What lessons might that hold for today? And for those who obviously are very excited about the next book on the third freedom, can you say a little bit more about it?
Well, it's going to be a little while. The Dawn of Everything took us 10 years to write together. It's not going to take that long, but it's going to be it's shaping up to be another long book. And it actually follows quite closely. I think it's going to follow quite closely the structure of the Dawn of Everything. And it also begins with the European Enlightenment. Um, Not so much Rousseau this time, but actually this guy who's right in front of me. This is the man who is credited with inventing what we now call international relations. And it's actually really interesting. I was like, watching all the news this week about the flotilla, Greta Thunberg, and so on, and people talking about maritime law and the freedom of the seas. So Hugo Grotius wrote that treatise, published in 1609. Mare liberum means the freedom of the seas. And it's often presented as the roots, the origins of our modern ideas of freedom of navigation, freedom of movement, free trade. But actually, it was written as a legal defense and a piece of propaganda to defend an act of blatant piracy committed by the Dutch East India Company against the Portuguese in the Straits of Singapore. So the real origins of what we now call international relations actually lie in piracy. And the book starts off by going into some of the recent scholarship on that, and also how it relates to the Dutch, mainly the Dutch encounter with the indigenous societies of the Indian Ocean, who it has been argued did actually have freedoms of navigation that weren't about raiding your neighbors and stealing all their loot. Um, and of course, people have pointed this out, and guess what? They get accused of romanticizing and noble savage tropes. So it's all very reminiscent of processes of research that Graeber and I went through in relation to North America for the first book. I'm recognizing the patterns of what happens in the academy that I belong to. And what an extraordinary filtering mechanism it is for dealing with these rather troublesome ideas and exceptions that we're confronted with sometimes. So that's the way in, and that leads to the center of gravity of the book. Geographically, will be around the Indian Ocean. Dawn of Everything ended up being quite a lot about the Americas because of the nature of the questions we were asking. Obviously, it was never trying to cover the whole world. but actually the Indian Ocean is an area that we barely write about. And intriguingly, I checked, there is not a single mention of Madagascar in The Dawn of Everything. It's not there. And as you know, that's where David Graeber did all his serious ethnographic fieldwork, was in Madagascar. So this is also giving me a way in to these debates that is also an attempt on my part to keep this in dialogue with David's ideas by going back to his early work and thinking about the connections, but also then by expanding the story out into the Indian Ocean, because you can't understand Madagascar. I mean, even the language, Malagasy, ultimately comes from Southeast Asia, from a valley in Borneo. I mean, all these places are connected. So those are a few pointers, if you like, of the directions I'm going in. And the book, I think, will be called The Third Freedom.
I mean, I'm sure I can speak on everyone's behalf that we're all really excited for it to come out. And yeah, we'll obviously be discussing it to, together and all the ideas in it. Thank you very much, David, for this conversation. Obviously, the kind of work you do, we could discuss so many areas of it for hours and hours. And hopefully, there will be more discussions of this sort, going, exploring deeper a lot of the things that we've touched on today, and also some of the areas we haven't even had a chance to touch on. So thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Always lovely to talk to you, Elif.
Thank you so much. So that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. As I said, we're a grassroots funded project, so your support really helps us keep going. Follow us at theamargi.com and on our socials to stay connected. And until next time, take care.